Ghostpaw.
My name is David Michael Lang. I'm 28 years old, and up until now I was an avid hiker. I didn't believe in the paranormal. In fact, I used to be the kind of guy who poked fun at the people who believed in UFOs. But now I can't even look outside. This all started about a week ago. A buddy of mine, Brandon, was telling me about his trip up to Yosemite Park. He was bragging about how he had found this new trail. He said it wasn't even marked on any of the maps or trail guides. Brandon and I had this one-up kind of relationship. Anytime either of us did anything, we had to one-up each other. It was just something that we did. Brandon had this smug look on his face the whole time he was talking, like what he had accomplished was something I could never top. But honestly, from the sound of it, what he did was the usual nonsense. Nothing spectacular besides finding a trail. It wasn't until the end of his story that I understood why he was so smug. Brandon pulled out his phone, and to my surprise, there he stood at the peak of a hill overlooking the Yosemite forest. The majestic landscape stretched forever in a boundless sea of green, yellow, and red. The picture literally made me gasp. But the true beauty, the thing that made Brandon smile as wide as he did, was perched upon his shoulder with outstretched wings. An American bald eagle. No fucking way, I muttered in disgust and envy. This must have been Photoshop. It just had to be. But unfortunately, Brandon had the claw marks to prove that the picture was real. Even though it hurt, he wore the wounds proudly. I couldn't believe it. The thought of topping this was daunting, but I somehow knew I'd best him. When there's a will, there's a way. I got all the landmarks I needed from Brandon, and without hesitation, packed up my gear. This weekend, I would prove myself the victor and wipe that smug look off of my friend's face. I left early the following Friday. I figured it would take about a day or so to get from the peak and back, so I decided I'd stay the night at the campgrounds. I checked in and quickly set up my camp. I didn't take much with me, other than my necessities and a few comforts. I tend to travel lightly. Once camp was set up, I made my way to the first landmark, a stump of a redwood that had scorch marks. It was a little ways off the trail, and I could see why Brandon would make his way to it. About 15 minutes west of that, I hit the second landmark, a giant stone slab that had a rather curious-looking vein running through it. The vein itself was massive, and it had the shape of a bird. It was quite impressive, but honestly made me wonder why it was not marked on any of the maps. No matter. From there, I went north until I could see the rigid peak of the mountainside I needed to hike. It looked to be about a 2-hour trek, but I was in good spirits. I ventured further into the thickets of the trees, hypnotized by their giant stature. How amazing they are. Redwood upon redwood I passed. If you didn't know what you were doing, it could be very easy to lose your way. Luckily for me, I was an experienced woodsman, but even the best of men can get lost. I finally reached my last landmark, which was the base of the mountain. I gazed up at the towering giant and smiled. I followed its base, to the east I think, until I found a rather steep slope. This is where Brandon made his way up. I began my journey forward. I look back on that now, wishing I had just stayed behind, wishing that my envy and pride had been in check. The hike itself was breathtaking, both literally and figuratively, for the inclined slope was a bit tougher than I had anticipated. But when there's a will, there's a way. After some time, I had to take a break. I took a seat on a nearby rock and began to eat my trail mix. The thickets of brush and trees blocked the view of the landscape, but the thought of what's ahead renewed my spirits. How dumb I was of what truly lurked about the forest. I finished up my snack, and that's when I noticed something hanging from a branch. I made my way to the round object and discovered that it was a dream catcher. The catcher was large and looked to be old. The cords looked leathery and cracked. The beads were made from glass, and its feathers were weathered for sure. But what truly caught my eye was a black leathery piece weaved into the center. It looked just like the same symbol that was marked on the slab. A bird of some kind. Maybe an eagle or a crow. But from the look of the wings, they totally trumped the size of the body. Maybe it was a condor? I couldn't really tell. I pulled out my phone and took a snapshot of it. I moved my hand over to it, and a sudden beat of thunder cracked overhead. The winds began to hiss and whip all around. The sudden force of nature ripped through me, booming, thumping my organs. I fell to the floor in terror, the dream catcher seemingly disintegrating right before my eyes. Once my nerves had come back into my control, I stood up and looked to the sky. The once clear sky is now darkened. It began to pour heavily. The water was freezing cold. It was too dangerous for where I was. I needed to be farther up. I needed to get to higher ground. It seemed to be level near the peak. I began my hike again, each step becoming more arduous as the dirt became mud. I needed to keep going. To stop now would only make matters worse. The thunder continued to boom overhead. Its rhythmic blast was something I've never heard before. I continued to hike, but I was damn near on my belly, soaked to the bone, freezing and exhausted. I finally reached the peak of the mountain. I lifted myself up, somewhat proud of what I had accomplished. Maybe I couldn't beat Brandon, but maybe this could make us on par. I took out my phone. I know, not the wisest of ideas, but I did it anyway. I took a quick selfie right as the lightning flashed. Perfect timing, I thought. And a moment later, and everything was black. I woke up sometime later. My back was burning in pain. I lay on the floor a little ways from the edge. I tried to move, but the agony was just unbearable. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still loomed overhead. Slowly, I reached over and touched my back. I could feel chunks of flesh missing from me. I screamed in horror and looked to my hand. It was a bloody mess. I could hear the thunderclaps echoing overhead. My pack was gone, but my phone was close by. I crawled over to it as best as I could. My only hope was that it still worked. The echoing began to draw closer. I needed to hurry before I was caught back in the rain. And with my last ounce of strength, I reached for my phone. It still worked! Unfortunately, though, I didn't have any service. I admit, I started to cry. There was only one thing left that I could do. I needed to make a signifier or something to get help on the way. I tried many times, but I just couldn't stand. I needed to rest, but I couldn't. The pain was just too much. I began to scream and shout, but it was all in vain. The thundering had finally reached me, but there was something else behind the boom. And if I tried explaining it to you, you would think I was crazy, but I swear to you, it's the complete truth. From under the thunder, I could hear this screech that cut through the air. It was nothing I had ever heard before. The cry was deep, but sharp as a blade. It made my ears ring, and it shook my vision. The experience was so much that it felt like I was floating in the sky. And actually, I was floating into the sky. I watched as the ground began to shrink beneath me. I lifted up above the peak and into the sky. I began to grow dizzy, and just before I blacked out, I looked to my stomach, only to see large black talons gripping me tight. I woke up sometime later in a dark, musty cave. There was almost no light except for some cracks between the large rocks overhead. Could this all be some kind of fevered dream? No, the pain was all too real. I managed to stand up, but I could barely walk. I looked all around to gather my bearings. Strewn all around the cave were these bones. They were all different sizes. They made up a trail to what looked like a nest. The nest was huge. It was about the size of a truck. And just like something out of an old dinosaur flick, this giant chick, I suppose you would call it, emerges from the wooden nest. Its eyes were as black as coal, staring intently on me. The feathery beast looked to me and was the size of a grizzly. How? How could a bird be this big? The chick chirped up at me and hopped from its bed. I froze in place. What would it do? My heart beat furiously in my chest. Closer it got, never taking its eyes from me. Once the creature had gotten within arm's length, I did the only thing I could think of. I extended my hand out to it, hoping to show it that I meant it no harm. I never thought birds to be vicious, but I was proven wrong that day. The chick lunged at my hands, and it took 3 of my fingers. I screamed and punched at it, and I was able to push it back, but it didn't stop it for long. It came back in a frenzy, screeching towards me. I looked around and grabbed the sharpest bone I could see. The moment I lifted up, the beast buried its beak into my left eye. The charge knocked us back. I repeatedly stabbed it, furiously as hard as I could. We struggled and struggled until over the ledge we fell. And the last thing I remember before I woke up in the basket was seeing the deep blue river. I'm really surprised I survived. I'm so thankful to be alive today. I'm also very happy I didn't run into Mama Bird. You see, the picture I took just before everything went black has her flying in the background. She looks like a flying freight train. But honestly, what I'm most grateful for is that Brandon won't ever be able to top this. Ever.